Welcome to the IAPMD professional community. Our monthly cycle science webinars are led by experts in the field. This cycle science community was launched in 2021 with the goal of accelerating the accumulation of rigorous, impactful cycle science by fostering opportunities for training, mentorship, and networking across all disciplines. The community will feature a monthly webinar in cycle science provided by an expert volunteer speaker. If you are not already a member or want to learn more, visit iapmd.org/pro. This session is the launch webinar of the cycle science community here at IAPMD.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. So I'm Tori Eisenmore-Mowell. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, did some additional training in clinical trials and the biology of reproductive mood disorders. I study premenstrual dysphoric disorder and premenstrual exacerbation, along with some other cycle-related outcomes. And I'm really excited to be here today, not in those roles, but as the chair of the clinical advisory board at the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. All right, so this is going to be me jumping on my soapbox now. So why do we need a cycle science community? Why are we doing this? Why am I here? Why did I invite you to this thing? So I think it would be nice if we had a place to turn that wasn't just social media. Because what happens is that there's a lack of connection and communication among us, I feel. And maybe some of you have had different experiences, and I'd be really curious to hear about those, in the chat. But for me, I feel that there's really not a shared space for communication and connection. And because of that, when people don't talk to each other, they don't develop a shared language. There's sort of this siloed areas studying the menstrual cycle, in social psychology, a lot of this sort of ovulatory focused stuff in the PMDD world, in psychiatry, where I am, there's sort of a certain set of jargon, and then I get the sense that in a lot of other small areas, exercise science, cardiology, they sort of have their own conventions for referring to menstrual cycle things. And I think this lack of a shared language really leads to differing keywords, makes it really hard to find the literature that you're looking for. We can't find one another's papers very easily, I feel, relative to some of my colleagues in other areas. So there's this inability to learn from each other, I feel, and a lack of standardization, of course, which hurts our science. Our measurements differ so much, right? Our phase measures, our diagnostic processes for PMDs, all these things. So it's not so much about what's right or wrong as it is about just a sort of a lack of communication generally in my experience. So another thing is that basic researchers become alienated from clinical literatures and vice versa. So there's sort of a lot of folks studying dimensional or population-wide effects of the menstrual cycle. And that really, in my view, often doesn't connect at all to the clinical literature in thinking about individual differences in hormone sensitivity. And that's, not anybody in particular's fault. I just think that there's, in my view, again, not a lot of communication that happens there. And I think that hurts us. I think that this leads to a frequent repetition of work and a failure to accumulate knowledge. And I think this also, of course, it's always difficult to do meta-analysis, right? It's always difficult to compare across studies, but I think it's particularly difficult in menstrual cycle research, more than usual, to do meta-analysis because of particularly these cycle phase definition differences and things like that. So that's a problem. I also think there's a major lack of training and mentorship. I was really lucky to stumble upon Susan Girdler at UNC Chapel Hill, who really was an incredible mentor and an expert in PMDD, who taught me so much and did a great job sort of helping me connect all of these disparate literatures. But I still struggled, and for a long time before I got to my postdoctoral fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill, I was interested in the cycle, but I didn't know there was no centralized sort of authority. These literatures all seemed so disconnected. I read a lot of things that seemed to contradict each other about the effects of the menstrual cycle. And as a trainee, I really didn't know what to trust. So it can be really difficult to find expert mentorship in the menstrual cycle, particularly expert mentorship that isn't just siloed, right? That isn't just like, here's my little area and, I'm going to teach you about that, but nothing else. So there's no centralized resource for training. The complex sampling, statistics, diagnostics that we use in this area often. I also think it's important to note that cycle scientists tend to be females, tend to be women. Not that those two are interchangeable, but both of those things are true. And women and females are often squeezed out of academic scientific careers. And so we've got the leaky pipeline, kind of playing into hurting cycle science, which I think is important to acknowledge. There's a lack of consultation across labs because there's sort of no central place to communicate, lack of central location to find opportunities. If I want to find a postdoc in cycle science, where do I go? So I think that's important. And then menstrual stigma and legitimate feminist concerns about, making overly general claims about the menstrual cycle impairing females, assigned female at birth people. I think that probably reduces social promotion of cycle science. And I think that's a shame because I think that they're so compatible when we get down to it. So I just wanted to highlight, I think training is really critical to thrive as a cycle scientist. It requires longitudinal data collection in most cases, which is expensive and burdensome and requires a whole bunch of nitty gritty. How do you send the daily ratings links, for example? How do you pay participants? Just everything with longitudinal is harder, right? And it requires that. Requires basic training in biology and measurement of the cycle. That's really hard. Yeah, somebody just posted shortage of grant opportunities. Absolutely. Although I think if we banded together and had a little bit more of a critical mass, I think it's possible that we could change that. I want to point out also that advanced statistics tend to be necessary to analyze menstrual cycle data, and I think that's another thing that can hold people back and can be frustrating and difficult. It requires skills, in multi-level modeling and things like that for nested data that aren't always required by PhD graduate programs, for example. And I think having a training in how to navigate journal selection and peer review is really tricky. I don't know about you all, but I'm frequently referred to women's journals. In a way that is feels a little bit sexist and unhelpful, and sort of because it's menstrual cycle related. And sometimes those are lower impact factor as well, and that's something we need to keep in mind. So I think training is really important to thrive in this area. Another why to create a cycle science is that I personally feel that we have a lack of integration in our models. There's a lack of shared language, training, and mentorship. There's no place to network, and there's very little standardization across labs. And because of that, it seems like there's, as I said, slow progress and a sort of reinventing the wheel in each field. And so our models, in the same way that people are siloed and don't communicate, our models often don't connect. Individual differences in how people respond to the cycle, at least in my area in psychiatry, seems to be the norm and a pretty accepted principle. Whereas I see in many other fields, even looking at menstrual cycle and behavior, they sort of exclusively talk about main effects, right? They expect all of their cycling participants to have the same response behaviorally to the menstrual cycle. And I think in some cases that may actually be true. There may be phenotypes, outcomes across the cycle where we do see more main effects and it's less heavily moderated by individual differences. But I also think that really hasn't been explored well. I think that we need integrated models that help us understand where main effects maybe dominate across the cycle and where there's a moderation by individual differences. Similarly, I feel that the literature is flooded with papers looking at main effects of the cycle, but not very many looking at why is it that, at least in the case of premenstrual disorders or behavior, why is it that we see big cycle effects in some people and very little cycle effects in others? What's going on with that? Very little work, in my view, examining the co-occurrence of cyclical symptoms across specialties. So, for example, menstrual migraine. What is the prevalence of premenstrual dysphoric disorder in menstrual migraine? I'm not sure we really know that. I don't think we know that, right? So this is the kind of thing that I think really, we should be talking to each other. And then the final and probably best reason, I'm here for IAPMD, right? So I have to say this, but it's really true. The patients with severe cyclical disorders, like treatment refractory premenstrual dysphoric disorder, are really suffering. They don't have access to good care in most cases. And I think that this disjointed, simplistic cycle science that's sort of far flung really it limits our ability to translate that back into clinical science that can help people. And that's, that doesn't have to be everybody's why, but for me that's a big one. Yeah. Great. So what are the goals that I have in mind in creating this? So connecting cycle scientists with each other, you know, the first thing and most important thing is just to connect people. These webinars hopefully will connect you to a bunch of experts who were able to recruit from this community to give talks. So hopefully you'll get connected to other people passively in that way. And then also the networking meetings. I'm hoping that will allow us to build some personal connections with other cycle scientists. I mentioned before thanking some of the people who are here from time zones where maybe this is the middle of the night or not very convenient. We did have some limitations, particularly related to the clinical practice time that was available. So we're keeping this time for now, but we really want to come up with creative ways to maybe have some additional networking times at times when people from other countries, maybe if we have a critical mass from a few different countries, we can consider doing some other times that works better for you. So we'll stay open-minded about that. Yeah, and then these online networking meetings, things that have been tossed around as ideas. I'm going to poll you all on these in a minute, but potentially an optional, you could opt in directory of cycle scientists with basic information, contact info from other members of the community, just basic research information, maybe a few publications that you think are representative of your interests. I've also thought about a Slack or Discord like forum for discussion among community members. One of the problems is that we need somebody to moderate it, and as I said, this is sort of all volunteer thing. So we'll have to throw that around, but I think that could be cool as well as a way to kind of post updates and announcements and connect. The second goal is to connect cycle scientists with patients. So we just concluded a PCORI, which is Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, a roundtable. The IAPMD was funded to bring together stakeholders in a bunch of different areas, patients, providers, scientists, to talk about premenstrual dysphoric disorder and what the barriers are and how we can work together as different stakeholders to address these issues. And it really highlighted the need for patient-scientist interaction, I think. Some of the coolest interactions that I witnessed at the roundtable were just scientists asking patients questions about their symptoms and starting to kind of make some of these connections. So several of the scientists that I talked to who did connect with patients reported having a really different perspective on premenstrual symptoms after interacting with patients for 2 days. So things like, not realizing that many patients with PMDD have symptoms for a full 2 weeks every cycle, or maybe not really appreciating the diversity of symptom content or timing. There were some things that came up that were really interesting around understudied phenotypes in PMDD, like sound sensitivity, which is something that's of interest to a lot of people who study irritability right now, and might have sort of some unique pathophysiologies that would be really important, interesting targets to understand. Just understanding poor access to treatment and the ways in which our current treatments fail. I think there can be kind of a general vibe of, well, we have treatments, they work among scientists, and if you spend any time with patients with severe PMDD, you'll find that we have a lot of work to do. So I think that connecting cycle scientists with patients is also something that is a goal. Increased access to training. Again, I'm hoping the webinars will provide some basic training for those who are looking for that. It will be archived on the website. So hopefully that will sort of be a gift that keeps on giving for many people. And then, in any of the ways that we can, work together to spread awareness about cycle science. I think many of us are affiliated with training programs, and making sure, for example, that clinical psychology graduate programs teach premenstrual dysphoric disorder as a DSM-5 disorder, and not as sort of a misplaced gynecologic disorder as they often do. Things that we're considering in this area, maybe a shared repository of reading lists or other sort of basic reading lists for cycle scientists to use in training, maybe a mentorship matching program at some point, definitely a bulletin board, a virtual bulletin board for opportunities, maybe grad student positions, postdocs. I know that I've searched for postdocs, for several years, and had a really hard time finding anybody who was actually interested in the menstrual cycle. And I have a decent profile online in terms of people being able to find me. So I think that, that's an area of need too. We want to promote the visibility of all of your great work. We want to, again, I think the menstrual cycle is a stigmatized topic, and it can be really easy to not talk about it and not sort of splash it all over social media, but we do great work and we deserve to be celebrated, and we deserve to have our wins celebrated. And it's important work. And so we want to increase the visibility of that work and kind of smash some of that stigma. We want to celebrate excellent cycle science and share highlights with the outside world on social media and just increase that visibility. We've considered doing profiles of community members. We've considered doing sort of data blitz meetings to promote the visibility of emerging cycle scientists. So people who are in training, who are doing cycle science, in a nice, open, non-judgmental space, just come and share what you're doing and you can get some feedback. That's something we've thought about. And then, of course, improving cycle science. We want to encourage discussion and collaboration to refine our models and our methods, hopefully build some more integrative models, encourage collaborations between specialties, basic and clinical labs, et cetera. I also think, with that, one thing that we can be sure will happen is that there will be a lot of disagreement. And I just want to say at the outset that that's good. And we need that. And as long as everybody's kind and respectful of one another, I think that we can, again, expect that and see that as a good thing, right? That, right now there isn't really a lot of spaces where you can debate methods, best methods in cycle science. And we need that, just like every other area. So, again, be kind to one another, but don't hold back if you disagree. Let's improve cycle science. One thing that's definitely being considered is methods panels, where several cycle scientists compare their approaches to common issues. So, for example, how do you clean your data to make sure to eliminate anovulatory cycles, if that's something that's important to you? I have heard as many very reasonable answers as people I have asked about that. And so, this is the kind of area where we need more communication and refinement. So, here's an overview of the menstrual cycle. Again, for time reasons, I'm not going to detail it, but this is just sort of a reminder for all of you of the predictable changes in progesterone and estrogen that happen during that time. There's also predictable changes in metabolites of progesterone that have turned out, at least in my read of the literature, to be really important for premenstrual disorders. So in particular, there's one substance of many called Allopregnanolone that's been really widely studied as a metabolite of progesterone that acts at the GABA A receptor in the brain, typically has a calming effect, and it follows a cyclical pattern with progesterone, although the calming effect seems not to be the case in PMDD. We'll get there. In PMDD, you can see in this red line sort of just a rough sort of cartoon here of what the symptoms look like across the cycle. So you see this increase across the luteal phase, it's peaking around the onset of menses, and then this relatively rapid drop off. In order to meet DSM-5 criteria, you have to have 5 symptoms. At least one of them has to be emotional. You have to have distress or impairment. This is sort of to allay very reasonable concerns from the feminist community about, hey, is this stigmatizing all females, all folks with menstrual cycles? We don't need to do that. This is to say, no, we're only going to diagnose if there's actually distress or impairment around it. Um, okay. There's also, I want to highlight, this is some of my work that's under review right now. I've seen a couple of other papers talking about this lately as well, that premenstrual dysphoric disorder, even when diagnosed with daily ratings, does seem to be associated with pretty high suicide risk. Very similar, I would say, if not greater than major depressive disorder. You can see that 30% of 620 respondents to IAPMD's survey, 620 people who reported having been diagnosed with daily ratings by a provider with PMDD, 30% of them, a little over 30% of them, said they had made a suicide attempt in their life. This is really a lot higher than the typical thinking about PMDD clinically. I think most clinicians are like, yeah, it's sort of a temporary depression and it's not maybe as severe as major depressive disorder because it's only there for a little while, right? And I think this shows that particularly if it's there for a couple weeks, you can get some pretty severe symptoms, including suicidality, and that's important to know. It looks like in daily ratings, about 5.5%, at least in America, demonstrate DSM-5 PMDD. So it's not all females, but it's certainly a substantial number. One thing that we've learned through unfortunate trial and error is that cross-sectional self-reports, so interviews asking, do you have premenstrual symptoms that go away with the onset of menses, that this does not match up. This interview-based assessment, or even just a single time point survey of, hey, do you have symptoms that are there premenstrually and then drop off? This doesn't match up with the daily ratings. This is a huge disappointment to everyone, right? Because it makes it really difficult to study it. But I will say personally, I see it in my data sets really clearly that if I just asked people, because I always ask them at the start, do you think you have these premenstrual symptoms? Are they there premenstrually? Do they go away? There's a lot of people who say yes to that question that don't show really any discernible change across the cycle. So there may be some methodological thing where we'll find out that we're just asking the question wrong. But I think right now, we've really learned that best practice is that you really need to have daily ratings. And certainly to make the diagnosis of PMDD, you have to have daily ratings across 2 cycles. And that's actually in the diagnostic handout. A couple of things we know about the biology. There seems to be an alteration in the serotonin system. There's a lot of evidence for that. SSRIs beat placebo way faster in PMDD than they do in depression. It seems to beat placebo after about 24 hours. So there's something going on there. There's a lot of findings related to luteal serotonergic function being altered. In addition, other studies have focused on understanding which of these hormonal triggers across the study might be causing psychiatric symptoms. So in this experimental study, there were two groups, PMDD, which they diagnosed with daily ratings, and then controls, which they also followed with daily ratings, and they didn't have any cyclical symptom change. At baseline, you can see that the PMDD group has symptoms, no symptoms in the follicular phase, and then they show up in the luteal phase. When you give a GnRH agonist, in this case leuprolide, which sends them into a medical menopause, the symptoms go away. We don't see the cyclical symptom change. This isn't true for all people with PMDD, but it seems to be true for the majority, that we can sort of get rid of the symptom cyclicity, get rid of the symptoms if we just shut down the cycle. Of course, we can't leave folks like that because it's dangerous to be in the menopause so early in your life for so long. Whoops. And so in this study, they then gave hormone add back, so estrogen and progesterone in sort of low luteal phase levels. And when they did that, they saw that the folks with PMDD history, their symptoms came back. So this, but not controls. So this is our evidence for differential hormone sensitivity, probably in the brain, to normal changes in hormones across the cycle. So this really rules out, since the whole axis was under experimental control in both of these studies, they did it twice, really to me is pretty strong experimental evidence that it's not a hormone levels problem. It's not a hormone ratio problem. It's also probably not a hormone metabolism problem based on some other studies we've seen. It really is this sensitivity, this differential sensitivity. They're more sensitive to these normal changes. What's fascinating is that in 2017, they followed up, they did the same thing all over again. They got the same pattern of results, but then after this first month of add back, they kept them on add back for 2 more months to see, do the symptoms go away? And they did. So in the second and third months of stable hormone add back, remember, they've got them in chemical menopause this whole time. They've added back hormones, their symptoms come back, and then they keep the add back hormones stable for 2 more months. In the second month and the third month, their symptoms go away again. So what this tells us is that it's not a sensitivity to levels of hormones. It's a sensitivity to acute changes in hormones. There's something about the PMDD brain that can't adapt to these normal changes in hormones and are triggering these emotional responses. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into all of this, but there's some evidence that that's mediated by the neurosteroid metabolites of progesterone, like allopregnanolone, and that there's some kind of problem at the GABA A receptor where there's this unexpectedly agitating response to normal allopregnanolone changes. Evidence-based treatments are SSRIs, oral contraceptives. The only ones that are approved at this point are the ones containing drospirenone given on a 24/4 schedule. It's a little ambiguous. It's a little ambiguous whether this is as, I don't think this is as strong a treatment approach as SSRIs based on the clinical trial data. And then GnRH agonists like the leuprolide, like I was talking about, with stable add back are given in the clinic now as treatment, but it's very hard for patients to access that. It's very hard to find providers that are comfortable doing that. Often people do opt for surgical menopause in the end. So there's a lot that we know. There's a lot that we don't know. The menstrual cycle, I'm talking about premenstrual disorders here because I'm representing IAPMD and trying to give a little bit of background on that. But the menstrual cycle in general causes a lot of burden and serious impairment and distress for people. And, I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not just an interesting research area. There's a lot of people out there that need help. And if we were working together a little bit more, we may be able to help them better. PMDs seem to need daily ratings to study. There are some treatments, but we need more. And it doesn't seem to be a hormone level issue. It seems to be a hormone change sensitivity issue. I really hope that we can build some more community in this important space. So thank you. I'll see you over there soon.